Welcome to Stop 5. Now we're standing at the Queen Street entrance to Northernhay Gardens. We can't obviously go into the park, as you can see here, because the Rugby World Cup, as Ewan said earlier, prevents our access, and it's closed for about a week, so it won't be reopening until probably the beginning of week 2 of term 1. But by the time you get here, you'll be able to walk through the park. Now the way to access this on the tour is to actually come through Athelstan's Tower, down the little slope, and then turn left towards the War Memorial, which is on the crest of the ridge, and then to come down to where we're standing, you just go down the ridge towards Queen Street, facing west. Now, Northernhay Gardens is actually Britain's first allocated urban park. It was at the very beginning of the 17th century that the monarch donated this land, which was owned by the king. So the city owned the land within the city walls, but the monarch owned much of the land from this point at the edge of the city walls all the way out to Duriard. Some of you may know that name because that's where a hall of residence is located, about 1.5 miles north of here. So this was the first example in Britain of a municipal park given to the people of Exeter, given to the city's population, particularly for the purpose of recreation and enjoyment. And this was a kind of revolutionary idea, because up until that point, anything that was outside of the city limits was very much this, it was kind of wasteland, unless you lived in a parish and you had allocated land, to grow crops on, or for your animals to have pasture land. The rest of it was, to be quite honest, it was wasteland. It was where people dumped their material waste, but also their human waste. But as cities began to grow, and Exeter was a city that by the 1700s was beginning to grow very significantly, people began to say, well, actually, what we really need is some space where we can get out of the squalor and the slumdom and the overcrowding of the city, and into some open areas which were a bit more natural. Now this is a good example of an urban pleasure park from the 1600s, 1700s, although of course most of the architecture, most of what you see in the park actually has a Victorian legacy and heritage. So you have the bandstand, the flower beds, and of course coming into the 20th century you have the War Memorial. So for centuries, these have been places where people have taken their recreation from outside of the city, outside of the squalor of the urban inside of the city wall, to take a Sunday afternoon stroll. Very interesting to have a look at some of the architecture in the park as a way of familiarising yourself with how pleasure gardens were constructed at that time. We can't show it to you here today because we're outside of the park, but if you're up by the War Memorial, just take a look up to the north and the west, towards the university and towards Exwick and St Thomas across the River Exe. These afford some fantastic views to demonstrate some of the topography that Ewan's been talking to you about when we were at Stop 4. Second important reason to stop at this point is what you can see if the camera turns round to the left now, is some of the most wonderful Regency and Victorian architecture in Exeter. Queen Street, which is where the camera is now pointing towards, was constructed in 1840 as a completely brand new street. So areas of the city were demolished in order to make way to this very new grand entrance road to the city that was afforded by the construction of the New North Road, which heads from here towards the university. And the people of Exeter, who were very wealthy people, and it's still a very wealthy city today, began to say what we need is a much grander entrance to the city. We've got to get rid of these very cumbersome city gates. We've got to tear down parts of the city wall. We're going to give people an example of some of the power that we have and the wealth that we have in the city. So if you walk up and down Queen Street, you will see the old hire market, which we're going to look at in one of our exercises, which is now the Guildhall Shopping Centre. Fantastic colonnaded building, which was once a fruit and vegetable market. And there, where the camera is pointing to now, the Rougemont Hotel, built as a railway hotel after, as Ewan said, the Southern Railway arrived in 1860. A fantastic illustration of this very grand architecture that people wanted to greet the visitors of the city as they arrived. And if you walk beyond the Rougemont Hotel up towards the university, you will find on your left-hand side more very grand Regency buildings, and then of course at the top the clock tower. So Queen Street and indeed Northernhay Gardens are examples of where architecture has been deployed for particular purposes. In the case of the park, for the purposes of recreation. In the case of Queen Street, as a way of showcasing the power and the wealth of the city. And on our next stop, stop 6, we're going to be looking at another illustration of the way in the 19th century that the City Improvement Commissioners tried to improve the well-being of the people of Exeter.